I want to drop you right now into the auditory reality of December 1914 on the Western Front.
Oh, yeah. That is a grim place to start.
It really is. And I don't want you to imagine like dramatic orchestral music welling up in the background or anything like that.
None of that cinematic gloss.
Exactly. I want you to strip all of that cinematic stuff away. I want you to just imagine a numb, freezing, absolute wretchedness.
It's hard to even conceptualize how bad it was.
It is. Like, close your eyes and listen to the sound of a bitter winter wind cutting across the flatlands of northern France and Belgium. Listen to the squelch of mud.
That constant, endless squelch.
Yeah, the constant maddening dripping of freezing water just pooling around your boots. The sound of a man a few feet away, coughing uncontrollably in the pitch dark.
And you can't even see him.
You can't. And occasionally, breaking through that misery, there is the distant, flat, and entirely pointless crack of rifle fire. It's basically misery that you can physically hear.
It really is the sound of a completely hollowed out human existence. I mean, when you read the primary sources from those first few months.
The diaries and stuff, right?
Yeah, the diaries, the letters. What strikes you isn't actually the terror of combat.
Really?
Yeah, it's the sheer grinding exhaustion of it all. The men sitting in those trenches were largely past fear by that point.
Like they just didn't care anymore.
Sort of. The human nervous system can only sustain, active panic for so long before it just shuts down to protect itself.
Right, you just go numb.
Exactly. So by December, they were past hope. They were simply enduring this cold, dark, deadened reality where the primary objective wasn't even to win the war anymore. It was just to survive until morning without freezing to death.
And there was this massive broken promise hanging over all of this misery, right? Like weighing them down even further.
Oh, absolutely. The whole over by Christmas thing.
Right. These men, and I mean the men on all sides of the line, British, French, German, Belgian, all of them, they were explicitly told the war would be over by Christmas.
It was supposed to be a quick trip.
Yeah. The propaganda machines had promised this quick, decisive, glorious conflict, like a summer adventure.
But the reality was vastly different.
Totally. Instead, 5 months in, the glory is just entirely gone. They are standing shin deep in freezing water in these ragged ditches. And out there, in the open ground between the lines.
No man's land.
Right, that blasted earth they called no man's land. Dead bodies are just lying in the mud, freezing and thawing. And they're far too dangerous to retrieve because, well, a sniper will take your head off if you even try.
It's a bleak, paralyzing situation.
It is. But then, across that strip of frozen mud came a sound that had absolutely no business being there.
A single male voice.
A single German voice singing Stille, Heilige Nacht.
Silent night.
Exactly, silent night, just drifting across the craters of no man's land. And the mission of our deep dive today, for you listening, is to explore a stack of historical accounts, letters, and surviving photographs that document what happened next.
It's such an incredible moment in history.
It really is. We are unpacking a spontaneous, entirely unsanctioned moment when the men fighting the deadliest war the world had yet seen simply decided to stop.
And we are looking at a really profound thematic tension today.
How so?
Well, on one side of the ledger, you have this staggering moment of pure, unadulterated human possibility, like a bottom-up grassroots peace that materialized out of thin air.
Right.
And on the other side of the ledger, you have the institutions in charge, the military high commands, the aristocratic governments.
The guys in the warm offices.
Exactly. And they found this spontaneous outbreak of humanity so utterly terrifying, so dangerous to their objectives, that they mobilized their entire bureaucracies to ensure it could never, ever happen again.
I want you, the listener, to really sit with that premise for a second. Think about the profound psychological leap it takes to stand up, physically expose your body in front of someone who has been actively, enthusiastically trying to kill you for 5 months.
Right, standing up in a trench.
Yeah, it's standing up just because they started singing a holiday carol.
Yeah.
Like, okay, let's unpack this, because to even begin to understand how impossible this moment was, we have to look at the massive machinery that put these men in those freezing ditches in the first place.
To set that stage, we really need to look at the tactical reality on the ground by December 1914.
Right.
You mentioned the broken promise of a quick war earlier. Well, the early months of the conflict, August and September, actually were characterized by rapid, sweeping movement.
So it wasn't always trenches?
No, not at all. You had massive armies marching across the countryside. But after a series of massive collisions events, historians call the Race to the Sea and the First Battle of Ypres.
Wait, the race to the sea? See, that always sounds so adventurous to me when I read it in textbooks.
Right, like a regatta or
Yeah,
something.
it sounds like a maritime sprint. But reading through our sources for today, the reality was just two massive, exhausted armies desperately trying to reach around the side of the other.
Just trying to outflank each other.
Exactly. Trying to outflank each other, digging deeper and deeper into the dirt to protect themselves as they moved north, until they literally hit the saltwater of the English Channel and just couldn't go any further.
That is precisely what it was. A lethal game of leapfrog that ended at the beat.
A lethal game of leapfrog. I like that.
And once they hit the coast, they couldn't go around each other anymore. So what do you do when you can't go around the enemy, and walking straight at them means walking into a wall of machine gun fire?
You go down.
You go down, you dig. The front froze into this continuous, unbroken line of trenches, stretching all the way from the Swiss border to the North Sea.
Hundreds of miles of scars in the earth.
Hundreds of miles. And once they were dug in, the physical and psychological conditions mutated into something almost indescribable.
I was really trying to wrap my head around the physical toll when reading the prep for this. It wasn't just the cold. It was the moisture.
The wet was the worst part.
Yeah, the mud wasn't just dirt. It was this paste of clay, human waste, and freezing rain. I mean, men were losing their feet to trench foot.
Which is an agonizing condition.
Right. Literally the flesh rotting off their bones while they were still alive, just because they couldn't dry their boots for weeks on end.
They were completely emptied out, physically and mentally. And you have to layer the sensory horror of modern industrial slaughter on top of that.
The bodies.
Yes, you brought up the bodies in no man's land earlier. That is a crucial psychological mechanism we have to understand. For weeks, these young men had been forced to look at the decomposing bodies of their friends and their enemies, just tangled in the barbed wire.
You can't escape it.
You can't. Every time they looked over the parapet, they saw their own likely future staring back at them. And the state's solution to this psychological trauma wasn't to offer comfort, right? It was to double down on state-sponsored propaganda.
Which brings up a really twisted mechanical problem for the governments. Like, how do you convince a teenage farmer from Yorkshire who just wants to go home to travel across the English Channel to shoot a teenage baker from Bavaria who also just wants to go home?
Right. It goes against human nature.
Exactly. You can't just say, go shoot that guy because the king says so. You have to fundamentally rewire their empathy. You have to teach them that the person on the other side of the field is not a human being.
You have to manufacture hatred on an industrial scale, and the propaganda on all sides was just vicious and highly coordinated.
Like what kind of stuff?
Well, British newspapers depicted the Germans as Huns, monstrous baby-killing barbarians, an existential threat to civilization itself.
Just totally dehumanizing them.
Completely. And German propaganda depicted the British as treacherous, greedy imperialists seeking to strangle the German nation. The state utilized every single tool posters, sermons from the pulpit, newspaper editorials to create an impenetrable psychological wall.
They made it so the enemy was an insect to be crushed.
A demon to be exorcised.
But reading these diaries, that psychological wall starts to crack. And it seems like it cracks because of a purely physical reality, the geography of the trenches themselves. I mean, how close were these opposing lines, really? Because in my head, a battlefield is this massive, sprawling plain.
In some sectors, it was sprawling. But in many parts of the line, particularly up in Flanders, the proximity was astonishing. We are talking about British and German trenches that were 50, 40, sometimes only 30 yards apart.
Wait, 30 yards? That's nothing.
It's incredibly close.
That's the length of a basketball court.
Yeah.
You could literally throw a rock and hit the guy trying to kill you.
And at that incredibly short distance, a fascinating physical phenomenon occurs. Acoustic isolation breaks down completely.
You can hear everything.
Everything. The propaganda posters in London tell you the German is a faceless monster. But standing in a trench 30 yards away, you can hear that monster sneezing.
Wow.
You can hear him cursing the rain. You can hear him crying out in his sleep or laughing at a joke his friend told. And that intense, unavoidable physical proximity slowly began to act as a solvent.
A solvent to the propaganda.
Yes. It chipped away at the monolithic, state-mandated idea of the enemy.
It's like being forced into a massive, lethal neighborhood feud by a psychotic landlord.
That's a good way to put it.
Right. He locks you in your apartment and slips notes under your door saying the guy next door is a literal demon who wants to murder your family.
But the walls are thin.
Exactly. The walls of the apartment building are paper thin. So you're sitting there clutching a baseball bat in the dark, terrified. But through the wall, you just hear the demon coughing, burning his dinner, and sobbing out of pure exhaustion.
Right.
And eventually, your own senses override the landlord's notes. You realize the guy next door is just as miserable and just as trapped as you are.
That is an incredibly apt way to conceptualize the cognitive dissonance these soldiers were experiencing. The machinery of the state is telling their brains one thing, but their raw sensory input, literally their ears, are telling them something entirely different. They are facing other miserable, freezing men.
But here's what I don't get. If the conditions were this universally awful, and everyone from the frontline grunt to the generals in the chateaus knew it, why didn't the leaders just call a formal timeout for the holidays?
It seems logical, right?
Yeah. Surely someone with authority looked at the calendar, saw Christmas approaching, and thought, let's pause this madness for a week.
Well, someone with immense authority did try. Pope Benedict XV,
Oh, Pope.
the Pope. In early December 1914, he actually pleaded for an official, internationally recognized Christmas truce.
I had no idea.
Oh, yeah. He appealed directly to the warring governments, pleading with them, and this is a rough translation, to let the guns fall silent at least upon the night the angels sang.
Wow.
He wanted a formal cessation of hostilities to allow for religious observance and, frankly, just a moment of sanity.
That's a massive intervention, the Pope stepping in like that. What did the political and military leaders say? I imagine you can't just ignore the Vatican in 1914.
They didn't ignore him, they actively rebuffed him.
Are you kidding?
No, the governments flatly refused the proposal. The leadership on all sides, British, French, German, Russian, made it explicitly clear that the war would continue without interruption.
Why not take a break?
Well, they argued that a truce would give the enemy time to reinforce their lines, resupply, and rest. From a purely cold military perspective, a pause is dangerous.
Wait, so the men in the mud are freezing, the Pope is begging for peace, and the generals essentially say, no, keep shooting.
Precisely. Which makes what actually happened on the ground so incredibly significant. Because the governments absolutely refused a top-down truce, it meant that the cessation of violence that was about to occur had to be entirely bottom-up.
It was a rebellion.
It was a rebellion of empathy. It was driven by the lowest-ranking men in the military hierarchy, acting against the direct, explicit directives of the most powerful men in Europe.
Which brings us to the spark in the dark. Christmas Eve, 1914. I was reading through the materials, and the catalyst for this whole thing actually came from a bizarre logistical decision made by the German High Command.
Yeah, the trees.
Yeah, it wasn't meant to cause a truce. It was meant to be a morale booster.
Yes, Kaiser Wilhelm II, the German emperor, wanted to raise the spirits of his troops who were stuck in the mud. So he ordered tens of thousands of small Christmas trees, Tannenbäume, to be shipped directly up to the German front lines.
Think about how surreal that is for you listening. You're in a freezing ditch surrounded by rotting corpses and barbed wire, and the supply truck rolls up and hands you a tiny pine tree.
And not just the trees. They were supplied with candles to light them.
Candles in a trench.
Yes. So on Christmas Eve, as the sun goes down and the freezing fog rolls in, the German soldiers started setting these small lit trees up on the parapets of their trenches.
Let's pause on the visual impact of that for a second. For the listener, you have to understand the rules of trench warfare. In a landscape of pure darkness where poking your head up means instant death, and you light a match, a cigarette cherry, a lantern, means you are about to attract a sniper's bullet.
Right. Light equals death.
Exactly. Light equals death. And suddenly, across the field, there are hundreds of glowing lanterns and lit trees appearing along the enemy line. It must have looked like an alien invasion to the British.
It was profoundly disorienting. The British soldiers initially thought it was a trick.
Of course they did.
Some officers ordered their men to stand to, weapons ready, assuming the lights were markers for an imminent night attack. But then the acoustic bridge you mentioned earlier comes into play. Out of the darkness, behind those tiny lights, the singing begins.
Stille Nacht.
Yes. The Germans start singing carols, and we have numerous first-hand accounts describing this exact moment. The British soldiers are gripping their rifles, looking at these lights, hearing this music drifting over the frost.
It must have been haunting.
It was. The sheer humanity of it bypassed their training, and eventually the British decided to sing back.
They just joined in.
They did. They started answering the German carols with their own "The First Noel, O Come All Ye Faithful."
I read one account where the Germans sang a verse of a hymn, and then the British applauded from their trenches and sang a verse back.
Like a concert.
Yeah, they were holding a transatlantic choir practice over a mass grave. But surely this couldn't have been happening everywhere, right? I mean, the Western Front was hundreds of miles long. Did everyone just telepathically agree to put their guns down?
No, no. The scale and geography of the truce are vital to understand because it wasn't a universal monolith. It was highly localized and quite patchy.
Okay, so how big was it?
Estimates suggest that roughly 2/3 of the 30-mile sector held by the British Expeditionary Force saw some form of truce. We're talking about perhaps up to 100,000 men participating in total.
100,000 men. That's a massive number of men committing mutiny, essentially. But why was it so concentrated in the British sector?
It had a lot to do with who was facing whom. The truce was particularly strong in areas where the British troops were facing Saxon regiments of the German army.
Saxons specifically.
Yeah. The Saxons were often perceived by the British, and frankly by other Germans, as being somewhat more easygoing and less militant than the fiercely disciplined Prussian regiments.
Oh, that's interesting.
There was a weird sort of shared class solidarity there.
What about the French and the Belgians? They were in the trenches too.
The truce was vastly rarer on the French and Belgian lines. And if you think about the psychology, it makes complete sense.
How so?
Well, the British had crossed an ocean to fight in a foreign field, but the French and the Belgians were fighting an occupying army that had invaded their homeland, burned their villages, and displaced their families.
Oh, right. It was personal for them.
Highly personal. The bitterness and hatred there were far more entrenched. It's much harder to sing a carol with a man who is currently occupying your living room.
That makes total sense. The proximity to the trauma changes the capacity for empathy. And what about the Eastern Front? The Russians facing the Germans and Austro-Hungarians.
The Eastern Front saw almost zero fraternization at this time, and the reason is a fascinating mechanical quirk of history: the calendar.
The calendar, like the literal dates on the wall.
Exactly. The Russian Empire in 1914 was still using the Julian calendar, which was religiously and bureaucratically mandated by the state.
Oh, wait. I think I know where this is going.
The rest of Western Europe was using the Gregorian calendar. The mathematical mechanics of this meant that the Russian Orthodox Christmas fell roughly 13 days later than the Western Christmas.
Oh, wow. So when the Germans were lighting their trees on December 24th, for the Russians across the field, it was just a random Tuesday in mid-December.
Exactly. There was no shared holiday to act as a catalyst.
That is wild. A purely astronomical bureaucratic difference in timekeeping literally prevented a peace movement from spreading east.
It's a stark reminder of how arbitrary the mechanisms of war and peace can be. But back on the Western Front, in the British sector, that shared date and that bridge of song led to something physical. The morning of Christmas Day arrives, the fog lifts, and the singing turns into action.
And this is the part that genuinely blows my mind. Because singing in the dark, safely hidden behind a dirt wall, is one thing. But the physical crossing into no man's land,
It's terrifying.
the mechanics of trust required to do that are almost unfathomable. Someone had to be the first to stand up.
They had to take that first step.
Exactly. By every rule of the previous 5 months, poking your head above that parapet was suicide. How do you take that first step, trusting that the guy who shot your friend yesterday isn't going to pull the trigger today just because you sang a song together?
The sources show it happened incredibly cautiously, often initiated by the Germans. We have accounts of hand-lettered signs being hoisted up over the parapets on sticks.
Like little protest signs.
Yeah, makeshift signs reading, often in broken English, "You no fight, we no fight," or "Merry Christmas."
It's like something out of a cartoon, but with life or death stakes.
And then, the critical moment. A single figure slowly climbs out of the trench. Often an officer or a brave private. They keep their hands empty and held high, showing they are unarmed.
Just totally exposed.
It is a moment of profound, breathtaking vulnerability. They are stepping into a killing field that has consumed tens of thousands of lives, betting their very existence on the hope that the shared humanity of the men on the other side is stronger than their military orders.
And the gamble paid off.
It did.
The British saw them, held their fire, and eventually men from the British side started climbing out too. They actually met in the middle. The deadliest, most violently contested ground on planet Earth briefly transformed into a frozen public square.
It's a miraculous image.
So I'm trying to picture this. You have hundreds of men wearing opposing uniforms, standing knee-deep in frozen mud, looking awkwardly at the guys they were shooting at 12 hours ago. What did they actually do?
They did what human beings naturally do when they are relieved to be alive and recognize another human being. They connected.
Just instinct?
Yes. The primary activity was trading. They bartered the meager, miserable items they had in their pockets.
I was looking at the lists of what they traded in the primary sources. It's so mundane, yet so poignant. Tobacco, cigars, tins of jam, rum, chocolate.
The Germans had a surplus of sausages and cigars. The British had excellent rations of bully beef and tea. It was basically a massive, spontaneous flea market in the mud.
But the detail that really stuck with me, the one that feels the most symbolic, is the trading of uniform parts.
Oh, the buttons.
Yeah. I read multiple accounts where they were cutting the brass buttons off their own tunics, taking the badges off their hats, and trading them with the enemy as keepsakes.
The sociological weight of that action is massive. Think about what a uniform is. A uniform is the ultimate symbol of the state.
It makes you a cog in the machine.
Exactly. It strips away your individual identity and marks you as an instrument of your government. By physically cutting the buttons off their own uniforms and handing them to the enemy, they were, in a very literal way, dismantling the identity the state had forced upon them.
That is profound.
They were rejecting their role as soldiers and returning to their role as individual men.
That is so powerful. It's a subconscious mutiny. And how do they even talk to each other to facilitate all this trading? I imagine the language barrier was a huge issue.
Surprisingly, no. The language barrier was highly porous, primarily in one direction. A shocking number of German soldiers spoke very easy, fluent English.
Really? Why is that? Was English taught in German schools that heavily back then?
Some, but mostly it was due to economics and migration before the war.
Okay.
The pre-1914 European economy was highly integrated. Tens of thousands of young German men had lived and worked in Great Britain before the conflict broke out.
I had no idea about that.
They had been waiters in London hotels, barbers in Manchester, laborers in seaside towns. When the war started, they were recalled to Germany to fight.
That creates such a surreal dynamic. You have a German soldier standing in the mud in France, asking a British soldier if a specific pub in Piccadilly Circus is still open.
Or if the tram still runs down a certain street in London.
They had shared geography, shared memories of a civilian life that the war had ripped away.
And that shared civilian identity led to the most effective propaganda killer of all. The photograph.
Oh, the family photos.
Yes. Men on both sides started pulling out their wallets and showing each other damp, crumpled pictures of their wives, their mothers, their children.
See, that breaks my heart. You look at a photograph of a man's toddler sitting on his lap back in Munich or Yorkshire, and suddenly the illusion is completely shattered. He is no longer the Hun or the Tommy.
He's just a guy.
He's a father, shivering in the cold, desperately wanting to go home to his kid, exactly like you. You can't unsee that humanity.
And that profound recognition of shared humanity led to what I consider the most heavy, consequential detail of the entire truce. It wasn't the trading or the singing.
What was it?
It was the joint burials.
The bodies in no man's land.
Exactly. For weeks, neither side could safely bury their fallen. The dead lay where they fell, a constant rotting reminder of the horror. The truce provided a sudden, miraculous window to finally offer dignity to their comrades. They organized joint burial details.
British and German soldiers side by side digging graves in the frozen earth.
Yes.
The physical labor of it, the shared sweat and the cold.
We have accounts of chaplains from both sides organizing bilingual services. They would gather the bodies, place them in mass graves, and soldiers from both armies would stand in a circle around the pit.
Together.
A British chaplain would read the 23rd Psalm in English, "The Lord is my shepherd," and then a German student would translate and read it in German.
Wow.
Men from both sides standing together, heads bowed, weeping, listening to the exact same words of mourning read over the exact same blood-soaked ground. It is an image of such staggering sorrow and immense solidarity.
I think we really need to pause on that and let the weight of it sink in for you listening. Because when most people hear about the Christmas truce today, they don't think about weeping men burying rotting corpses.
No, they don't.
They think about the football game, the legendary soccer match in No Man's Land.
Yeah.
But reading these accounts, I feel like we have to be incredibly careful not to Disney-ify this history.
I agree completely. The legend of the football match has somewhat outrun the historical reality over the last century. It's a comforting image, but it obscures the grit.
Right. The popular image is this neat, organized international match, England versus Germany, guys taking off their coats for goalposts, a referee keeping score. It makes a great movie scene. But the historical accounts conflict wildly on this, and it's heavily mythologized.
It was not a sanctioned sporting event.
Exactly. The reality was much messier. Did they kick things around? Absolutely. There were kickabouts. A bunch of freezing guys kicking a makeshift ball or an empty ration tin or a sandbag stuffed with straw sliding around in the mud.
It was kinetic energy, a release of tension.
Right. And more importantly, we cannot let a romanticized, sanitized football game overshadow the dark, heavy truth of the joint burials. It wasn't a holiday camp out there. It wasn't a party.
Far from it.
It was a brief, desperate grasp at humanity in the middle of an industrial slaughterhouse.
That is a crucial distinction, and that incredibly powerful display of humanity, the shared grief of the burials, the sharing of family photographs, the trading of uniform buttons, was a massive existential threat to the war machine itself.
Because it breaks the conditioning.
Exactly. If you know a man's name, if you've seen a picture of his children, and you've stood shoulder to shoulder with him weeping over a mass grave, the psychological mechanisms of war break down.
You can't just go back to it.
You cannot easily climb back into your trench the next day and shoot that specific man in the head.
Which means the generals sitting miles behind the lines in their warm chateaus must have realized their entire war effort was evaporating in front of them.
They were losing control.
If the frontline troops simply refuse to hate each other, the war is over. How did the military hierarchy react when the reports started filtering back that their armies were exchanging chocolate and burying the dead together instead of firing artillery?
With absolute apoplectic horror. Now, it's important to distinguish between the junior officers and the senior command.
Right, the guys actually in the trenches.
Yeah, the junior officers, the lieutenants and captains actually living in the mud with the men, they often joined in the truce, or at least deliberately looked the other way. They shared the misery, so they understood the need for the pause.
They were just as tired.
But the senior commanders, the generals miles away, viewed this as a catastrophic breakdown of discipline.
I was reading through the directives, and one name jumped out, General Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien. He commanded the British 2nd Corps. He didn't just frown upon this. He viewed it as a literal infection.
Yes, Smith-Dorrien was incensed. He issued a highly confidential directive to his division commanders expressing his absolute disgust. His primary concern was what he called the offensive spirit of the troops.
The offensive spirit, meaning the willingness to walk into machine gun fire without questioning it.
Precisely. Smith-Dorrien explicitly warned that this kind of friendly intercourse with the enemy was destroying that spirit. He understood that empathy was a corrosive acid to military discipline, and the reaction on the German side was equally swift and even more severe.
What did the German High Command do?
On December 29th, as the truce was still lingering in some sectors, the German High Command issued a strict, formal order forbidding any further approach to the enemy.
Did they just call it bad discipline?
No, they went further. They classified fraternization as an act of treason.
Treason. That is literally a capital offense. They were threatening to execute their own men for shaking hands.
Yes, they were threatening the firing squad. Now, the mechanical reality of that threat is interesting because no actual courts-martial or executions resulted directly from the 1914 truce on either side.
Well, how could they? You said earlier that up to 100,000 men participated. You can't execute 100,000 of your own soldiers. If you try, you don't have a firing squad. You have a full-blown revolution. Your entire front line collapses.
That's the paradox of the crackdown. The scale of the mutiny protected the mutineers. But the threat of treason wasn't about punishing the past. It was about controlling the future.
Sending a message.
Right. It was a psychological shock designed to snap the chains of discipline back into place.
This raises such an intense, terrifying question about human systems. How do institutions enforce hatred when the individuals making up that institution have explicitly chosen empathy?
It's a very dark question.
Because the generals realized a fundamental truth of human violence. An army that does not hate cannot fight. That face-to-face contact in no man's land had dissolved 5 months of multi-million-dollar state-sponsored propaganda in a single afternoon.
They recognize that when you allow soldiers to see the enemy as a mirror of themselves, the machinery of slaughter jams. The entire structure of military conditioning is designed to override the deep, natural human aversion to killing a member of your own species.
And the truce broke that conditioning.
Complete.
But hold on, let me play devil's advocate for a second.
Yeah.
As much as I want to believe this was a pure angelic moment of peace, I know human nature is messy. We can't overly sentimentalize the soldiers either. It wasn't all just pure innocent sentiment and trading chocolate, right?
Yeah.
I imagine some people took advantage of this situation.
That's a very sharp point, and it's essential for historical accuracy. War is a deeply pragmatic, cynical enterprise. We know from the diaries and unit war diaries that officers on both sides used the cessation of hostilities in a highly calculated manner.
How so? What were they doing?
Reconnaissance.
Ah,
While the privates were trading buttons, officers and NCOs were out in no man's land taking furious mental notes.
scouting.
Yes, they were checking the layouts of the enemy's barbed wire, identifying where the machine gun nests were located, and looking for vulnerabilities in the trench lines. They also used the time to repair their own battered fortifications, digging deeper and reinforcing parapets without the constant, terrifying threat of sniper fire.
So it really existed on a spectrum. On one end, you have profound, genuine fraternization and shared mourning. And on the other end, you have calculated, tactical breathers, where officers are essentially mapping out how to kill the guys they are currently smiling at.
Exactly. It was a deeply complex, multi-layered human event. But even with those tactical advantages, the military leadership knew they had a massive public relations nightmare unfolding.
Because of the letters.
Right. Because as these men retreated back to their trenches, they did what anyone does after a profound experience. They started writing.
The letters home.
Thousands and thousands of letters, flooding the postal systems, bypassing the censors who were overwhelmed by the holiday mail volume. Soldiers writing to their wives and parents, describing exactly what had just happened. You will not believe what I did on Christmas Day. I shook hands with a German. He showed me a picture of his family.
And it wasn't just words, there were cameras. A handful of personal pocket-sized cameras had made it into the trenches. Photographs were taken in no man's land, and the film actually made it back to London and Berlin.
The visual proof.
You suddenly had civilian newspapers renting literal photographic proof of British and German troops standing together, smiling, sharing a light for a cigarette in the middle of a war zone.
The visual evidence was irrefutable. The military leadership realized they were rapidly losing control of the narrative. If the public realizes the enemy isn't a monster, support for the war collapses.
So they had to shut it down.
They had to ensure this spontaneous peace was permanently eradicated.
So how do you force men who just shared a cigarette to go back to killing each other? Because after Boxing Day, as January approaches, the officers start cracking the whip. The meetings in no man's land thin out. But the transition back to violence wasn't smooth, was it?
No, it was highly fraught. When the orders came down that the war must resume, there were numerous documented instances where the men simply refused to aim at each other.
Right.
We have accounts of units mutually agreeing to fire high.
Firing over the heads of the enemy.
Yeah.
Wasting ammunition to make it sound like a battle was happening for the benefit of the generals behind the lines.
Exactly. They were deeply reluctant to kill the specific men they had just buried the dead with. It took time. Rotation of troops moving units to different sectors where they didn't know the faces of the enemy, and brutal discipline to slowly recondition them into killers.
They had to break the bond.
And the institutions made absolutely certain that a moment of vulnerability like 1914 would never be permitted again.
Which brings us to the active erasure of this peace. Let's fast forward 1 year, Christmas 1915. The war has only gotten more apocalyptic. We've seen the introduction of poison gas, the escalation of relentless earth-shattering artillery shelling.
It was a different war by then.
But as Christmas approaches, some of the veterans who remember the miracle of 1914 thought, maybe we can do it again. Maybe we can stop the machine for one day.
A few units did try. We have records of tentative attempts to sing or raise signs in 1915. But this time, the high commands weren't caught by surprise.
They were ready.
They had anticipated it for months. Strict, unequivocal orders were issued weeks in advance. Threats of severe punishment, specifically court-martial and execution, were not just implied, they were aggressively communicated down the chain of command to every single soldier.
But they didn't just rely on paperwork and threats, did they? Reading the source material, the military enacted a chilling, active tactic to physically prevent peace from breaking out.
They did. Artillery units up and down the line were given highly specific, timed orders to heavily bombard the front lines on Christmas Eve, 1915.
Let's break down the mechanics of that because it is incredibly dark. If we think about artillery, we usually think of it as a tool to destroy a bunker or kill a troop concentration. But this order wasn't about tactical destruction. It was a deliberate acoustic weapon.
That is the perfect way to describe it. An acoustic weapon.
Like modern electronic warfare, where an army uses a jamming device to scramble the enemy's radio signals. But here, the generals were using high-explosive artillery shells to jam the frequency of human empathy.
It's horrific.
They were creating a wall of deafening noise, explosions, and flying shrapnel for the explicit purpose of ensuring that no man would dare climb out of the trench and no voice singing a carol could possibly carry across the wire.
It was the mechanized, industrialized suppression of empathy. They used the weapons of the state to literally drown out the sound of humanity. And the tragic part is it worked flawlessly.
It broke the cycle.
By the time Christmas 1916 rolled around, a year later, the psychological landscape of the war had fundamentally, permanently changed.
Because 1916 was the year the slaughter went completely off the scale.
Yes. 1916 brought the Battle of Verdun and the Battle of the Somme. We are talking about millions of casualties in single battles.
Unimaginable numbers.
Men being vaporized by artillery, drowning in mud, choking on phosgene gas. The sheer volume of mechanized death had hardened every heart on the continent. The fragile, spontaneous humanity of 1914 had become an archaic relic. It was literally unimaginable to the men fighting in 1916 that you could ever shake hands with the enemy.
The war just swallowed that humanity whole. The sources note that widespread cross-line ceasefires would not return to the Western Front until the final armistice in November 1918. 4 full years of grinding, mechanized murder followed that Christmas, and by the time the guns finally stopped, 15 million people were dead.
15 million?
15 million. And because the reality of the 1914 truce was so utterly contrary to the apocalyptic horror that followed, the story of those men trading buttons in the mud started to slide into myth, didn't it?
It did. Memory is a fragile thing, especially when the state prefers you forget.
Right.
Over the decades, it became a sort of fairy tale, a whispered legend. Some historians and military men later even doubted it had happened at all on any significant scale.
They thought it was just made up.
Yeah, they dismissed it as a comforting fable that traumatized soldiers told themselves to cope with the sheer horror of their reality.
Why do you think people were so eager to dismiss it as a myth?
Because the reality of it is actually quite painful to accept. Think about the implications. If peace was that easy, if it could be achieved in a single afternoon by simply choosing to walk out of a trench and shake a hand, then the ensuing 4 years of slaughter, the 15 million dead, were entirely unnecessary.
Oh, wow.
The truce proves that the war was a choice made by institutions, not an inevitability of human nature. That is a very bitter pill for a civilization to swallow.
But we know it wasn't a fairy tale. That's why we anchor a deep dive like this in the physical evidence.
Exactly.
The letters exist, the brass buttons in the display cases exist, the actual unretouched photographs of those freezing men standing together, sharing a smoke in the mud. They exist. It was real. So we arrive at the ultimate question of this dive. We look at this event, this singular, brilliant glitch in the matrix of a world war, and what do we take away from it as modern listeners?
We take away a terrible and simultaneously beautiful truth about the duality of human nature and the immense power of the structures that govern us.
For a few days, the men fighting the worst war in history up to that point looked across the barbed wire, looked past the multi-million-dollar propaganda campaigns, recognized themselves in the filthy faces of their enemy, and they stopped. Entirely on their own volition.
They chose to stop.
The killing could have ended right there in December 1914. If the men on the ground simply refused to fight, the war is over. The power always rests with the masses. But the institutions bolted the door shut.
They forced them back.
They forced the men back into the trenches, issued the threats of treason, fired the acoustic artillery barrages, and ensured the slaughter continued for 4 more years.
And this is where I want to offer a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over as you step away from this history and back into your own life.
Okay, let's hear it.
We have been deeply conditioned by our history books to think of peace as a highly complex, formal, top-down process.
Yeah, like treaties and summits.
Right. We think of peace as something that must be painstakingly negotiated by important leaders in ornate rooms, involving complex treaties, diplomats, and fancy fountain pens. But the Christmas Truce suggests something radically different. It suggests that peace is actually our default human setting.
That when the artificial systems of division are briefly turned off, empathy breaks out automatically.
Oh,
It doesn't need to be negotiated, it just happens.
precisely. If empathy is so natural, so deeply inherent to our species, that it can spontaneously break out in the middle of a literal bloodbath amidst freezing mud and decaying bodies, we have to ask ourselves a difficult question about the society we live in today.
Which is,
In our modern world, we aren't fighting in muddy trenches, but we are increasingly isolated in our own digital trenches. We are separated by algorithms, ideological firewalls, and media ecosystems that constantly tell us the people on the other side are monsters who want to destroy our way of life.
so the question becomes, what invisible artillery barrages are currently being fired right now by our modern institutions and platforms just to keep us from hearing each other sing?
Exactly. What noise is being generated simply to prevent us from recognizing our shared humanity?
That is the exact thought I want you to sit with today. The memory of 1914 didn't stop the First World War. The hatred was issued to those young men, exactly like their rifles, exactly like their itchy woolen uniforms, and they were forced by the state to carry it. But the memory of that Christmas proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the hatred wasn't native to them. It wasn't in their blood. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives and the hatreds you are handed, and remember to always listen for the singing over the wire.